is my pleasure to be moderating, which just means I'm a timekeeper, for the section that we're doing called Civic Engagement and Sports and Recreation. Oh, and we have Dawn's headshot on the video. Okay, great. This is one of the critical pieces of welcoming is certainly making sure that there is adequate engagement. We want to make sure that people are going to be retained or they will remain in a place because they are engaged at every level of that community. And so that's why we are bringing this particular topic forward. It's my pleasure to introduce Carolyn Andrew. I'm going to introduce our main speaker, and then after Carolyn, I'll introduce the panel members, and they're going to come up in order, all right? So our main speaker on this topic is Carolyn Andrew. She's the director of the Center on Governance at the University of Ottawa.
Thanks very much. I hope I'm audible at the back, and if I stop being audible, let me know. Thanks very much. I hope I'm audible at the back. And if I stop being audible, let me know. And thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you to Dawn and thank you to Welcoming Communities. This is a real pleasure to be here. And I think our panel is at a terrific time because in fact the groundwork for why this panel is important has been laid by yesterday and this morning. In fact, picking up on what Marla said this morning about yes, employment is very important. And yes, once you start thinking about that, things spread out, and the whole question of if you want social infrastructure, what all you need in order to make sure that people come and that they stay. And I think the whole question of civic engagement fits in very nicely. It fits in very nicely also with what Jerry said this morning about the vision. And so I think what we're talking about also this afternoon is the story, the vision about Northern Ontario and how this relates to civic engagement. What I'm talking about when I'm talking about civic engagement is wanting to be part of deciding the collective direction for a community, a country, an association, your neighborhood, whatever. It's that feeling that you want to be part of making decisions about how the collectivity moves on, whatever collectivity we're talking about. And I think civic engagement is, so it has two dimensions to it. It has the dimension of the people who want to be engaged or don't want to be engaged. What is it about them, what they feel, what they want, what are their aspirations, what are their conditions in life? And we have to think about that, and I'll talk a bit about that. And then there's the other part about what are the institutions we're talking about. And I'm meaning institutions from formal associations to governments to all kinds of institutions. What are the messages that those messages or programs or rules that those institutions are putting out about engagement? And I think it's important to think about both sides of that. And certainly just to remind us of the worldwide context now, we are seeing some spectacular demonstrations of civic engagement in North Africa, in countries, and I think it reminds us of the question of what happens when institutions and formal institutions are so blocked that people have very dramatic alternatives about ways of civic engagement. And I certainly don't want this to get into a discussion about North Africa. It's a discussion about Northern Ontario. But I think it's important to remember that there's a whole range of civic engagement, and it's very important to work really hard to make our society as open and as inclusive to all forms, to a whole range of possibilities of having people engaged in making decisions and feeling part of collective decisions about their future. So I just wanted to add a couple of bits of information. One very interesting study that was done on social participation in Canada and its evolution from 1992 to 2005, and the changes that were going on in how people were socially participating. All the sort of statistics on participation, things were going down. So there's less social participation in 2005 than in 1992. And this was measured by the number of hours of giving time to organizations. So the question is sort of the gift of your time to organizations. And what seems to be the factors that were playing out, and they divided it into sort of formal voluntary activity and informal. Formal is being part of an association, it's being in an advisory, boards of government, boards of organizations, running for office, all kinds of formal things. Informal is helping people, is helping your neighbors, is taking soup over when people are ill, whatever. And the two factors that seem to be playing out, or two of the gendered factors that are playing out, is that women were doing less formal voluntary activity in 2005. Seems to be linked to the fact that they're doing a lot more working into the paid employment field, and therefore question of time. And men are doing a lot less of the informal activity, of the informal helping in 2005 as compared to 1992. We could doubtless get into a fascinating discussion about why that's true, but we won't go there today. It's just to point out that both, but I take two lessons from this, from looking to see what's happening to sort of informal helping activities and the more formal. Two lessons. One is that we have to widen our views, is to take seriously all that, the informal sector of engagement. We have to take it very seriously. We have to widen our views of what civic engagement is in a more informal way. And that's why this panel is so terrific to have included culture and sports and recreation as parts of civic engagement, because they are, I think, two of the huge fields where informal forms of civic engagement are hugely increasing. Probably somewhat under the radar for some of us, but really important that sports is an area where people do play with people of other different groups, or don't, as the case may be. We have to look at what are the factors that play into that. And it's also culture is a whole other area of forms of expression and civic engagement, and working. And what we're thinking about in this case too is still the giving of time for the collective enterprise. So we're talking about coaching, we're talking about driving not only your kids but everyone else's kids to where they're playing sports. We're talking about organizing cultural activities for other people. We're not talking about just you going and playing sports. That's maybe not civic engagement, but what we're talking is the gift of time for being part of collective decisions about what's going to go on in your collective life. The second one is about, so that's the first one, and I think the whole concept that we were looking at about innovation is really important there, to think about these new innovative forms of civic engagement. And I think also the second part of it is to go back and look at the institutions and to see what are the messages the institutions are giving out, and what are the ways that these messages do or don't help in forms of civic, of people who want to be part of deciding their collective future. What are the messages that institutions are giving? And I think one of the important things to think about from the evolution from 1992 to 2005 and even more now is how much more increasing multiple identities we all have in life. So I think it may be harder for institutions to capture that, but I think it's an important thing to realize that we may not only think of ourselves as citizens or residents of Northern Ontario, but there's a lot of people in the world who think of themselves in terms of different kinds of identities. Am I a youth? I'm not. Am I a senior? Yes, I am. Am I a woman? Am I a man? Am I different kinds of ethnic identities, different kinds of racial identities? And I think that part of the complexity for institutions now is to think of those multiple identities. So it may be that the institution thinks it's being welcoming, but it's not being welcoming in a way that captures all the desires of different people in our society to be part of deciding that they want to be part of the collective decisions about North Bay, or they want to be part of the collective decisions of Northern Ontario, the pan-North, and they want, that is the way they see their identity. So I think we have to be very aware of that with institutions. And this brings me to my second bit of information, which was in the Globe and Mail yesterday and the National Post this morning, I think, just to show that this is up-to-date research. It was, it was an article, Canada's ranking in what's called the Migrant Integration Policy Index. And it does also illustrate a whole debate yesterday about what rankings are about, because you'll be happy to know that Canada ranks third in the world in terms of immigrant integration, behind Sweden and Portugal, which is a surprise to some people, but and does raise questions about what are the indices. But what the point I want to make is not where we rank overall, but we rank 18th in political integration. We do terribly in where 18th is not good. It's not 400, 18 out of 400, it's 18 out of not very many more than that. So, so what I want to look at is why do we do, and what is their argument. Now, one of their arguments, which is another issue that I'm not really going to deal with today, one of the big arguments was that Canada doesn't give the vote municipally to landed immigrants. They give only the vote to Canadian citizens. You have to be a Canadian citizen to vote municipally. And there's a lot of European countries, now different contexts, European Union, a lot of European countries that have given the vote. This has been a great big campaign in Toronto, and it's an interesting issue, but I'm not going to discuss it because it's not the issue at hand today. But it is a good example of the messages being given by institutions. In this case, it's not only a message, it's a rule. You can't vote. Now, it's an interesting rule because every time I teach it, students say to me, sorry, miss, you're wrong. My family immigrated from Italy, 10 years ago. They've always voted municipally and they continue to vote. And I say, yeah, I know it's actually is the law that they can't vote, but it's not very well looked after in a lot of municipalities. But I actually do know what I'm talking about. This is, the students are always saying, you really don't have a clue because my parents vote all the time municipally. And I always say, oh, well, you're right, but I'm right. So anyway, we won't get into that discussion. It's an interesting question. But it is about the way formal institutions have rules, but they also, probably more importantly, and I think Viviana is going to be talking about that, they also have practices about who's included, who's excluded, who's comfortable at a meeting, and that brings in all kinds of dimensions, obviously linguistic dimensions. In Ottawa, est-ce qu'on peut parler français à des réunions publiques très peu souvent? Est-ce qu'on est confortable parlant français? Pas du tout. So there's all kinds of questions about that. There's also questions we all know about public meetings. The eloquent get a lot of space. Those people who are not so good, and eloquence tends to go with being conflictual and being in opposition to those who are conducting the meeting. So we know a lot about even the kind of comfort levels of how organizations do. But what I want to just end with is some good practices, because I think that there are some really good practices. And following from, I think, Jerry's comments this morning, I think it's really important to focus on, not what's going wrong, but what's going well, and what are possible things to learn from. And again, always learning that what you need here in Northern Ontario is your own way of figuring out civic engagement, not somebody else's, but it's always good to know about good examples. One of the arguments in the Globe and Mail is the work being done by Diverse City, which is an alliance between Maytree and the Greater Toronto Civic Action Alliance, which is just to give public information about people who are sitting on committees, boards, councils. Just who are they? Who do we put in positions of authority, just named to positions of authority? And do they represent the whole community? And does that give a sense to the people thinking about those organizations that that could be a relevant place for them? And the second one I was going to give, but Crystal beat me to it, was the City for All Women initiative from Ottawa, the Equity and Inclusion Lens, which is a really lovely tool for, it was basically done in Ottawa in a collaboration between the City for All Women initiative and the City of Ottawa as a way of making the city workers' life more doable and more interesting. And so it covers the whole range of areas of policy development and areas of interaction between the community and the city in a very, hopefully, user-friendly and attractive. It covers 11 marginalized groups and gives descriptions of them, but it really was done as a way of trying to enhance the capacity of the city to give a mirror to the community of its welcomeness and its inclusion, and that being a better, giving a better face to the way that citizens could interact with the city would bring more people wanting to be part of deciding the collective future of their community, of your community, and of all of our communities. Thanks very much.